International Memory of the World Register. Today's presentation will be, or lecture will be on the impact and development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have some wonderful speakers here today, but I'm going to hand off to Edyta Rogowska, our Secretary General here at McGill, to give some opening remarks, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Anthea. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us today, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. So it's a privilege to welcome you from Montreal, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among the Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. McGill University honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the land and waters on which we gather today. It's also my pleasure to welcome you to this special lecture series celebrating a truly remarkable milestone, the inscription of John Peters Humphrey onto the International UNESCO Memory of the World Register. Born in 1905, John Peters Humphrey was a visionary legal scholar and a proud member of the McGill community. After teaching law here in the early 1940s, he was appointed in 1946 as the first director of the United Nations Division of Human Rights. And in that role, he supported the work of the drafting committee for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt. Humphrey himself was the principal drafter of the declaration, of course, a foundational document that continues to shape global human rights disclosures to this day. We are proud that the McGill University Archives holds the early drafts of this historic text in the John Peters Humphrey phone. These drafts were rediscovered in 1988 by John Hobbins, then head of the Law Library, whose efforts were instrumental in bringing Humphrey's pivotal role to light. We are honored to have Mr. Hobbins with us today as one of our speakers. After retiring from the United Nations in 1965, Humphrey returned to McGill's Faculty of Law, where he continued to teach and inspire students almost until his passing in 1955. His legacy lives on, not only in the documents he helped to shape, but in the generations of scholars and advocates that he influenced. In addition to Mr. Hobbins, we are also delighted to welcome two distinguished speakers who bring an international perspective to today's conversation. Danielle Hughes, the head of the archives at the United Nations office in Geneva, and Rebecca Adami, senior lecturer at the University of Stockholm. So thank you very much for joining us in honoring John Peters Humphrey's life, his work, and his enduring impact on the global human rights movement.
Thank you so much, Edyta, and for your opening remarks. And again, thank you to all of you who are joining us here today. I'm going to provide a short biography for each of our speakers, and then we will allow them to present each in turn, starting with Danielle, followed by John, and then obviously last but not least, Rebecca. After which, then we'll take questions. We have about 30 minutes set aside for questions, but please feel free to put any questions that you have in the Q&A. You should see in the top bar of the meeting a little Q&A button. So that is where we ask that you put any questions that you have. You can upvote the questions if you like, and then we'll go through them in sequence. Rio Justice, who's our assistant here today, she's going to be helping me go through the questions, and they can be asked to all the speakers or individually to the speakers. So to start off, Danielle Hughes, is an archivist working with the United Nations office at Geneva. She has worked for the Sisters of Providence of St. Vincent de Paul, the Government of Canada, as well as the International Residual Mechanism for the Criminal Tribunals in Arusha and Tanzania. Arusha, Tanzania. Danielle is also a lecturer at the Haute École de Genève in the undergraduate archival studies program. So welcome, Danielle. Next is John Hobbins. John Hobbins is a librarian emeritus at from McGill University and literary executor of the human rights advocate John Peters Humphrey. In 1988, he discovered the documents that proved Humphrey prepared the first drafts of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Since then, he has written many articles on the Humphrey's papers, as well as editing 4 volumes of Humphrey's UN diaries. Last but not least, we have Rebecca Adami, Associate Professor, who is also the author of the book Women and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 2018, a UN photo exhibit, Women Who Shaped the Universal Declaration, based on her research, was exhibited at the UN in New York. Adami's research has focused on the role of women drafting the UN Charter and the UDHR, as well as the work of the CSW in its first decade. So now I'm going to hand off to our first speaker, Danielle Hughes, who is going to talk a bit about some of the member country papers that form part of the development process of the UDHR. Danielle, over to you.
Thank you, Anthea. So welcome. And today we're just going to take a quick look at what the UN archives in Geneva, as well as the UN archives in New York, holds for the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So the history of the UN Library and Archives Geneva begins back in 1919 with the League of Nations. And the League of Nations Library was created alongside of the League Secretariat in order to serve the delegates to the Assembly and the Council, as well as the Secretariat staff members, and was originally conceived as a modern library with 90,000 volumes. The League Library soon also started developing archival collections, and specifically on the history of international relations. In 1931, there was an essential fond acquired on international peace movements, and these are the private papers of Alfred Fried and Bertha von Suttner, the Austrian pacifists for around the end of the 19th century. And thus, we are ensuring the preservation of archives from an important part of the peace movements prior to 1914. In September 1927, just after the League of Nations decided to construct a brand new building, J.D. Rockefeller offered $2 million to the League of Nations to build and endow a library building. And it was Rockefeller's idea that this library and archives would not only serve as an information center for the Secretariat of the League, but also as a center for research and an instrument for international understanding. The reason the Palais is located where it is today is due to the library and to the Rockefeller Fund. The original plans of the new League of Nations building had not included a physical building for the library. And with the Rockefeller donation, the original plot of land chosen, which was along the shores of Lake Geneva, was too small to accommodate this addition. And the League negotiated new parcels of land and for larger space and ended up where we are today in Ariana Park. With the closure or the ending of the League of Nations in 1946, all assets, including the library and the archives, were transferred to the newly created UN. And today, the UN Library and Archives Geneva continues to uphold Rockefeller's vision and remains a center for intellectual, academic, and cultural research to the global community, and a hub for cultural diplomacy, academic exchange, and the study of multilateralism. In 2025, the UN archives and official documents related to the drafting of the International Bill of Human Rights were also inscribed into the UNESCO Memory of the World Register. And this was a joint submission between UN Archives, Library and Archives in Geneva, and the UN Archives and Records Management section based out of New York, as archives are found in both of these locations. So the International Bill of Human Rights is made up of three documents, three pieces: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the focus today, as well as two covenants: the International Covenant on Economic and Social Culture Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The dates we have chosen for this submission were 1946 to 1966, and these dates enclose major milestones. So in 1946 was when the ECOSOC established the Preparatory Committee, also known as the Nuclear Commission on Human Rights, which is basically the commission that drafted the Universal Declaration and went on to draft the two covenants. In 1966, denotes when the adoption of the covenants actually took place. So this is not the Library and Archives' first memory of the World Register collection. In 2009, the entirety of the League of Nations archives, about 3 linear kilometers, were also inscribed. So let's get into the substance of the archives around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A distinction has to be made. In the UN world, an official document is a text that has been submitted to a principal organ or a subsidiary organ of the UN for consideration, and it usually in connection of an item on an agenda. Official documents are identified with a unique alphanumeric number. Often today we see the UN logo. And this is a practice that is carried on since 1946, and we still do it today. UN archives, on the other side, are the documents and records that are created and used by the UN staff members in their day-to-day work, as well as the commissions and bodies that are attached to the UN. Now, it can certainly be argued that UN official documents really are archives, but in the UN world, this distinction is very separate, and these products are managed separately and very differently. So what do the UN archives and official documents actually tell us? We are able to see the very beginnings of the process that was undertaken. In early 1946, in the UN official documents, we find preliminary drafts of international declarations that were submitted by governments and by organizations. Most notably, we see here the ones from the Cuban delegation as well as from the Panama delegation. But there was also submissions from Chile and submissions from organizations such as the American Federation of Labor. This allows us to get a glimpse into the workings of the Commission, because at the time, the Commission had prepared a textual comparison of the preliminary drafts. In 1946, we find one of the highlights of the archives held in Geneva, which is a letter from Mrs. Roosevelt to Secretary General Tocqueville. And it is noting that member states must really basically get their ducks in a row and work quickly to turn around in order to be able to meet the deadline of late 1948 of submitting a draft for the International Bill of Rights to the General Assembly. In late December, what we discover is what we refer to as the Geneva Draft, and this is the first translation of the Declaration and the Pact. And the Geneva Draft is covered with marginalia and annotations, and it provides an indicator of the work behind the scenes and of the actual drafting process by the committee members. The archives and the official documents related to the drafting of the declaration also show shifts in language, and one of the most important shifts that has happened is the shift of the wording of the first article, or Article 1. The first draft originally read, "All men are born free and equal in dignity and in rights." And it was in early 1948, the chair of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, Bodil Begdrupt, proposed that the wording should be changed to "all people." The adopted version of the declaration actually reads "all human beings." This change was also influenced by Hansa Mehta, a female delegate to the Commission on Human Rights, as well as Eleanor Roosevelt, the chair of the Commission. These women, along with others, also influenced changes and gender inclusiveness in areas around marriage, family, and work. And these are clearly visible going through the UN official documents as well as archives. The archives show us that the drafting process is truly a multilateral process. It involved governments, organizations, as well as private citizens from around the world. These archives represent the multilateral collaboration between the UN, world governments, organizations, large and small, from around the globe, as well as the general public, in the drafting of these milestone documents in the history of human rights, which set out for the first time the fundamental rights to be universally protected. It must also be noted that all of this happened in a span of about 18 months to 2 years. And this is at a time when internet had not yet been invented. Everything was happening through snail mail, physical mail, as well as Europe, amongst others, were just coming out of the Second World War, and countries were prioritizing rebuilding themselves and recovering from widespread devastation. Up on the screen, you see two of my favorite letters in the archives that we hold in UN Geneva. The one on the left is a letter from the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty of Animals, asking that animals also be included into the International Bill of Human Rights. And the one on the right is a letter from a private citizen from Switzerland, as it happens to be, a Mr. E.W. Prevot, dated April 1948. And the crux of his letter is requesting the UN to create an International Day of Recognition for Human Rights to be celebrated around the world. 2 years after the declaration was adopted in 1948, so in December 1950, the UN did indeed designate such a day. And the date that they chose was the original date, December 10th, of the adoption of the declaration. The vast majority of the archives that are drafted are held by the archives in Geneva, and the vast majority of them have been digitized and are available online for the public to access. They are available through the UN Geneva platform, which you can see here, and they are in 3D high color, ready for researchers to look at. The smaller portion that is held by the UN Archives and Records Management section in New York has also been declassified, and some have been digitized on your available on their platform here. So the question that you may be wondering is, why is there a split between New York and Geneva, especially when all of the drafting processes took place in New York. And so the story behind that is that in 1945 to 1973, the Division of Human Rights was actually located in New York. And then in 1974, due to a lack of space in New York to accommodate the vast growing division, they were moved to the offices in Geneva. When the division moved to Geneva, they brought along with them only their current records that they were working with. And this included records that dated from the 1970s to 1974. It became very apparent quickly that they required all of their historical archives. And in 1975, they requested the New York registry system to send the files to Geneva for ease of reference. Over the years, it was discovered that not all the division's files actually had made it to Geneva, and thus the split is between the two locations. The UN official documents are available through through various platforms on the UN official document system. But here I would like to highlight a very good research guide that has been created by the UN Dag Hammarskjöld Library in New York, which itemizes out the UN official documents in a timeline platform. And they are all have been digitized and available through this resource. So thank you very much. I send it back to you, Anthea.
Thank you very much, Danielle. So I'm going to hand over to John, and I'm just going to go help him get set up. So give me 2 minutes.
Right, I've turned the microphone on. the world can hear me.
Yep, there we are. And Dutch. Oh, yeah, I want.
Yep. Okay, thank you very much. And good day, everybody. I've been asked to speak about the original drafting of the declaration, but I hope from a different perspective from Daniel, because she covered much of the similar ground. Now, 75 years ago, it was a very different world people lived in. And prior to 1945, international law was strictly the law between nations, and it contained no concept of individual persons. Such rights as individuals possessed were granted by their national governments and, obviously, varied greatly from state to state. The horrendous treatment of people in the Second World War, especially but by no means limited to the Holocaust, created a climate where there was a willingness to discuss individuals in international law. The Charter of the UN stated that there must, quote, be universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction to race, sex, language, or religion. President Truman stated he was looking forward to the framing of an international Bill of Rights. The Economic and Social Council of the UN, ECOSOC, was given the responsibility for this dossier and in turn established a nuclear commission charged with making recommendations concerning the structure and function of the Permanent Human Rights Commission. At this time, individual rights were generally divided into two broad categories: civil political rights, such as the right to vote and freedom of speech, and social economic rights, such as the right to work and universal access to healthcare. This created a huge difficulty in that the US and other right-wing countries were opposed to social and economic rights, which were perceived as a means of introducing socialism, if not communism, to their countries. Conversely, the Soviet Union and similar countries were equally opposed to civil and political rights, which threatened the state dictatorship. Basically, the two most powerful nations in the world did not want an international bill covering both types of rights. And I suppose even today, although the Soviet Union no longer exists, Russia doesn't really like freedom of speech so much, nor does America think, well, they think that poor old Bernie Sanders is a communist, but going for universal health care. Now, the international bill was to have three parts: a declaration of principle, a convention binding on signatories, and thirdly, means of implementation. It was decided, in view of the strong opposition to the aforementioned various types of rights, it would be best to start with a declaration, which would not be binding on member states and thus more acceptable. That therefore became the first task of the newly created Human Rights Commission. The Human Rights Commission was a political body with 18 members from various states and met for the first time in January 1947. The Commission appointed as its chair Eleanor Roosevelt. She enjoyed enormous prestige, not just as the widow of a beloved American president, but also in her own right as a popular journalist and liberal political activist, noted for her independence. Importantly, though many in the US questioned her suitability, she had the support of President Truman, who had been her husband's vice president. She was not an experienced diplomat or even a great intellectual, but the remainder of her executive more than made up for any lacunae. The vice chair was Peng Chung-chang, known generally as PC Chang, and head of the Chinese delegation to the UN. And here we see him. She meets Eleanor Roosevelt. The sinister-looking chaps behind Eleanor are her State Department advisors, who were always hovering around throughout the whole process, and generally annoying John Humphrey. Now, Chang was what is known in the West as a Renaissance man, gifted in many areas. A brilliant intellectual, he was a playwright, musician, educator, and diplomat, devoted to traditional Chinese music and literature, but conversant with Islamic and Western culture as well. He'd obtained his doctorate in philosophy under John Dewey at Columbia University, and he returned to teach at Nankai University. In 1937, he joined the anti-Japanese resistance, but ultimately had to flee, disguised as a woman. He was recruited by the nationalist Chinese government and served as wartime ambassador to Turkey and Chile. After the war, he was named ambassador to the UN. Chiang's greatest asset at a time when nations and individuals were often at loggerheads was to find common ground between antagonists, often by quoting Oriental wisdom. Charles Malik of Lebanon, the rapporteur, was an equally brilliant philosopher, though from a rather different school. He was the son of a poor doctor and a Greek Orthodox Christian. He studied philosophy under Martin Heidegger at Freiburg and Alfred Whitehead at Harvard, where he received a doctoral degree in 1937. He took up a teaching post at the American University of Beirut, but like Chiang, he was soon drafted into his country's diplomatic service. He became ambassador to the US in 1945 and subsequently head of Lebanon's delegation to the UN. His style, however, was far more forceful than the smooth diplomacy of Chiang, but together they would form a useful partnership. Now, as mentioned earlier, the UN created the Division of Human Rights within the Social Department to support the Commission on Human Rights, to aid in its work and to gather rights documentation from all over the world. The Assistant Secretary General for Social Affairs was French physiologist Henri Laugier. He was very anti-fascist and had to flee from France during the war. He came to America, but not speaking a word of English. They sent him up to teach at the University of Montreal. And here he befriended John Peters Humphrey, a professor in international law at McGill University, because Humphrey was bilingual and also Laugier's right on the English-speaking world. In 1946, he asked Humphrey to become the first director of the division. Thereafter, Humphrey was always at the side of Mrs. Roosevelt as secretary through all the meetings of the commission. Okay, Mrs. Roosevelt invited her executive and Humphrey to tea in her Washington Square apartment to discuss how to begin their duties. Chiang, the pluralist, and Malik, the devout Christians, quickly got into arguments about the best resources to study for the Declaration. And Humphrey, whose doctorate was in political science, happily joined in. He got on very well with Chiang, and they attended cultural events together. In the photograph on the left, maybe hard to read, but it's dated Geneva 1948, and he writes, "To Dr. and Mrs. John P. Humphrey, fellow travelers to the Swan, most cordially P.C. Chiang." So it shows more than just a business relationship. He also enjoyed more vigorous debates with Malik. And here you see a picture of Humphrey on the left arguing with Malik on the right. And the gentleman in the middle, who appears to be on Humphrey's side in this particular discussion, is Hernan Santa Cruz of Chile. He came from a very rich Chilean family, but was a socialist. And he was the acknowledged leader of the many Latin American delegations and partly responsible for getting them to agree to drop the insistence that God be mentioned in the Declaration. Now, Mrs. Roosevelt found the conversation between these three brilliant and opinionated men extremely heavy going. So she decided, according to autobiography, to remain silent and stick to pouring tea. The upshot was that since no group could write a draft, Humphrey was asked to write one for the commission. Malik recommended he read the works of St. Thomas Aquinas as a preparation, while Chiang wryly observed a few years' study of Oriental wisdom might be more useful. Humphrey says he ignored both these bits of advice. Though Humphrey was a North American and a conservative profession, he had become a sociologist during the Great Depression. Given a free hand by the executive, he decided to include both civil, political, and social economic rights in his draft. And indeed, the declaration retained this duality to its final iteration when it was adopted 2 years later. For his sources, he drew on other declarations and national constitution and tons of material collected by his division over the previous 6 months. Over the next 6 weeks, he worked on improving his draft. The first handwritten draft and 6 typed and annotated revisions survived and were discovered in 1988. And we can see here on the left is the first page of the first handwritten draft, the very first page of it actually, in Humphrey's handwriting. And on the right is the third typed draft. And these are all annotated and quite useful for seeing how things evolved. At the top here, it says, you can't read it, shown to Mrs. Roosevelt, February the 28th, 1947. Then I can't read the rest of that. Then a note down the side saying, Mrs. Roosevelt requested the preamble also include mention of her husband, Franklin Roosevelt's 4 freedoms. So throughout the things, you see her suggestions and all the changes. Now, Humphrey's draft had 48 articles. In mid-March, Mrs. Roosevelt reported to ECOSOC that the Secretariat had prepared a draft, but this caused an unpleasant stir. The French delegate complained a draft could not be created without the input of Europeans, while the Soviet delegate stated that there had to be participation from the communist nations. Mrs. Roosevelt responded that the Secretariat had merely done some preliminary work for the drafting committee, and she created a drafting committee to meet the following June. The committee, she said, would have both French and Soviet members. ECOSOC approved this committee and requested the Secretariat to prepare an outline for the committee's consideration. Humphrey had just spent 6 weeks preparing a full draft of the declaration, and he was a little annoyed at this development. He therefore added the word outline to his draft, to the title, but otherwise changed nothing. His draft would become known as the Secretariat Outline. The drafting committee met in June 1947. Members were given the Humphrey draft along with a 400-page book of sources used. Now, in this photograph from the first day, members seen here, well, on the left there is Chile, you can't see him, but that's N and Santa Cruz, Hodgson of Australia, P.C. Chang of China. Here, the Assistant Secretary General of the UN, Henri Logier, who was just there for the first meeting, Eleanor Roosevelt, Humphrey, Malik, a Soviet representative who was Vladimir Koretsky. And the Soviets went through 4 representatives on this commission in a year and a half. So the most important was Alexei Pavlov, who was there to the end. He was the nephew of the drooling dog chap. Sorry, somebody's laughing at me. Now, they formed a 3-man subcommittee to deal with the Secretariat outline. After some discussion, the French representative, René Cassin, was asked to look at the Humphrey draft and make such changes as he thought appropriate. And here we see René with Eleanor Roosevelt. Cassin did this over a single weekend with the help of Humphrey's deputy, Émile Giraud. He did not add anything, but anything substantive, but he reordered the articles into what he considered a more logical framework and combined some. So his draft had 46 articles. The drafting committee concluded its work by forwarding both the Secretariat outline and the Cassin draft to national delegations, non-government organizations, other intergovernmental bodies, and even prominent individuals for comment. Over the next year, the Commission dealt with all the suggestions. And in the previous presentation, you'll see all the documentation going with that. I'm not going to go into it here. Some concepts from the original draft, such as the protection of minority rights, were omitted. As Humphrey ruefully noted in his diary, some nations were more interested in assimilating minorities rather than protecting them. Excuse me. The declaration was whittled down by the Commission to 28 articles, finalized and sent to ECOSOC for approval. This approval was easy to obtain as Malik was the chairman of ECOSOC at the time. The declaration was forwarded to the Third Committee of the General Assembly unaltered. And on the left, we see Malik as chairman of ECOSOC. On the right, he's chairman of Committee 3. You'll note that one says chairman, the other says president. This is that the UN used chairman in its English documentations and president in its French documentation, but it was the same role. Now, in the Human Rights Commission, the declaration was developed by individuals, many firmly committed to the project. The Third Committee was quite different, as some nations wished to see the project fail. The Soviet bloc attempted to drag discussion on each article as long as possible and then abstain on any vote. The hope was that the declaration would never get to the General Assembly. Sadly, these same instructions were given to the Canadian delegation, who also abstained in the final vote in the Third Committee. The South African delegate argued that, while some of the rights belong to all, others, like the right to vote, should only be accorded to the white minority. Saudi Arabia could not accept the equality of women, while most Muslim countries were concerned about the right to change religion. These differing interests might have been enough to doom the declaration, but for the remarkable leadership from the chair. The Third Committee met 169 times over 3 months. Malik, as you see in the photograph, was the chair, and he exercised his authority ruthlessly. He limited interventions to a few minutes, prevented filibustering, using a stopwatch and a gavel, and forcing votes on articles. You see him here in both roles, and the gavel firmly in hand. Whenever delegates seemed deadlocked on issues, P.C. Chang would intervene, quoting Oriental wisdom. And somehow the difficulties were resolved. Finally, on December 7th, 1948, the preamble and 30-article declaration we know today was adopted. The final change being the title from International to Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So at this point, Roosevelt and Malik, who had spent so much time working on it, could finally relax, and Eleanor brought in some children to see the president. You can actually see there's an acute accent on the president. And Malik finally handed over his gavel to a little girl there and could smile at last. 3 days later, the declaration was adopted by the General Assembly with no negative votes, but 8 abstentions. Canada changed its abstention to a positive vote in the 3 days because of the tremendous amount of pressure put on them. And poor old Pearson, the head of the delegate, writing to the Canadian Prime Minister saying, I'm in the same bloc as the Soviet Union, and Saudi Arabia and South Africa. I don't want to be there. So Canada voted for it. Now, today I've concentrated on a handful of the more important drafters. However, many delegates made significant contributions, and literally thousands helped in its development through consultation. As Humphrey wrote, the Declaration had no single father like Thomas Jefferson with the American Declaration of Independence, and it was the very anonymity of authorship that gives the Declaration its great moral authority. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. That was a really great presentation. I'm going to pass over now to Rebecca Adami.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask Ria for help now with sharing the PowerPoint. Yes. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me participate in this panel with experts. I think that both Danielle and John have covered a lot of the drafting process. And as you all by now already see, there were a lot of people involved in this process. So next slide. You can see that I've done some research into the founding years of the United Nations, and I must start by sharing some personal notes on that. You know, having looked at clip archives from the time, you know, at the end of Second World War, as a researcher, I was shocked when I saw that you had photos coming out from the concentration camps. You had stories of Nazi officers letting dogs attack children in the concentration camps, like horrific stories, and you had images in the newspapers. And in those same newspapers from 1945 and onwards, there were also images from Sweden, from the US, from other countries in Europe, where you had commercials. There were some Swedish men, for example, in a new sauna. And as a researcher, I was really shocked by that realization that, you know, the United Nations was being created at a time when all of these images were coming out and shocking the conscience of the world. And at the same time, life was just continuing as usual. And unfortunately, I'm not shocked anymore, since we see, you know, horrific images from the ongoing genocide that the United Nations have spoken up against. But we still also have all of these, you know, images in social media that life is just continuing as normal for most of us. So that kind of the contrast and the paradox with people wanting to hold on to something that we can call human dignity and the shared humanity is still today something that, you know, that we need to kind of fight for, also by being reminded of history. So the founding of the United Nations was this call that countries had to stand together against fascism, and also this realization that if we didn't have something called human rights that governments needed to respect, then there wouldn't be any lasting peace in the world. And I mean, we see this ideal being questioned again and again, and that's why we don't have any lasting peace in the world. And we also have a lot of speeches today at the United Nations talking about those same ideas of fascism, of not granting asylum, as, you know, that's one of the core ideas of human rights, that they should be something more, something else than civil rights, than citizens' rights. Next. Next. Yeah. So why did they draft the Universal Declaration? And back one. Yeah. So why did they draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Well, the UN Charter sets the mandate for the United Nations, and it mentions that this organization, this should be an international platform to protect, promote, respect the idea of human rights. But as John also mentioned, what human rights would stand for was not evident. The Soviet Union, for example, thought that a Universal Declaration of Human Rights would be a declaration defining the rights of states. So the idea of human beings having rights, regardless of whether they had citizen rights or not, whether they had citizenship or not, was really a new idea on an international platform. And at the drafting of the UN Charter, you had women organizations also lobbying there in San Francisco. And there was some divides already in 1945 between, for example, US female delegates and women delegates from Latin America and South America. You had, next we can show, you had Berta Lutz and Minerva Bernardino from Brazil and from Dominican Republic. They talked very passionately about women's rights to be inclusive in the idea of the rights of man. And their ambition was actually being met with some skepticism from the female delegate from the US, Gildersleeve, who thought that this was a kind of radical feminism that you didn't need anymore, because in many countries women had gained the right to vote. But Minerva Bernardino and Berta Lutz said that it was really important to actually mention gender equality in the UN Charter, because it would not be understood as inclusive of women if you retained the term the rights of man. This is a quote by Minerva Bernardino: "To retain the term the rights of man would threaten the great achievements that women have reached in the field of rights. Indeed, we are sure that many countries would produce a pitiful confusion that would be detrimental to the dignity of the female sex and their aspirations towards a fair and total equality." Both Minerva Bernardino from the Dominican Republic and Berta Lutz from Brazil were surprised to see that one of the greatest opponents to actually explicitly mention the rights of women in the UN Charter came from those same countries where women had gained the right to vote and where they've gained a formal equality. But again, I think that the whole process of drafting these documents came with a lot of power negotiations, and also the way that language was being discussed reflected privilege and ignorance that comes with taking for granted rights that you already have. So not knowing the need, the urge, and the struggle to actually ensure that this is inscribed in international legislation. It was the hope for both Minerva Bernardino and Berta Lutz to have the UN Charter and also a Universal Declaration of Human Rights being the kind of documents that organizations and women could refer to in the national context to hold governments responsible. And next. And of course, that's also a very idealistic notion. We know today that, for example, in El Salvador, that President Trump is supporting as, doing great achievements in the field of criminal responsibility. They're also imprisoning women organizations for corruptions and new legislation that makes it really, really difficult for women organizations to continue struggling for women's reproductive and sexual rights, for example. So having some kind of international framework for human rights was really something that some people at the United Nations held very high. I would say that the notion of equal rights of men and women in the preamble in Article 8 in the UN Charter was very much thanks to the Latin American feminist lobby at the San Francisco conference. And I think that Article 8 is really important because it speaks about the importance of women and men to have, equal access to positions in the different UN bodies. Next. this is an example of the aspirations of the United Nations at its inception. So, for example, some experts viewed the ECOSOC to become even more important than the Security Council to prevent future wars. I think this is kind of interesting, especially in light of the harsh criticism against the Security Council for actually continuing international aggressions and wars because of the veto power standing against different interventions. But there was this idea that the Economic and Social Council will deal with the foundational reasons for war and work for fair play in world trade, a maximum of production and employment, free exchange of information, and unhindered international exchange of people, money, material, and ideas. This is a quote from a newspaper that I found in the Clip archives in Sweden, how they talked about ECOSOC, and they thought that the Security Council would be reduced into an appendage of only historical interest, but without any remaining functions, because they really had this idea that, you know, if ECOSOC could work based on that mandate to try to ensure that there was some kind of equal and fair trade in the world, then economic prosperity and people's possibilities in different countries would prevent future wars. We have not seen this happening at all. So this was also a very idealistic view at the founding of the UN. Next. So as both Danielle and John mentioned also, even though Humphrey made the first draft of the Universal Declaration, the declaration went through different bodies. So it was also being discussed in the third committee at the General Assembly. So you had even more delegates joining, and you also had through them a lot of lobby from different international organizations speaking on behalf of their specific interests. But it's also important to note that at the founding of the United Nations, in the UN Commission on Human Rights, you had individuals with a lot of expertise in the field of human rights, in political theory, in philosophy, and so forth. This is not really how the delegations work in these different bodies today in the United Nations. Yes, for example, the Commission on the Status of Women has grown a lot, but you also have there NGOs with consultative status, and you have interests that are also hindering a lot of debates that you didn't have in 1947 when the Commission on the Status of Women was created. Next. So the declaration, there was a lot of discussions in the Human Rights Commission about the philosophical principles behind the idea of human rights. And Hansa Mehta, who was a delegate of India in the commission, she was rather annoyed by these lengthy philosophical discussions between Malik and Chang, for example. And she, at one point, she wondered whether the commission would be satisfied with an academic discussion of a Bill of Rights, or whether it wished to implement such a bill. And Tony Sender from the US Federation of Labor seconded Hansa Mehta and said that the peoples must have faith in the United Nations, and consequently, if it is decided to draft an international Bill of Rights, it must be shown that it is not merely a matter of empty words, but that decisions made will be applied and enforced. And this is something that we see has not really become a reality at all. And you could also see very clearly from the UN archives and the meeting protocols that the rhetoric of human rights was being championed by the very same colonial empires that later when they were going to ensure that human rights were being coded in the two covenants, tried to, for example, ensure that there was a colonial clause in the covenant so that human rights would not include people living in non-self-governing territories. And next. And you also had women delegates. You see, for example, the second woman from the right there, Marie-Hélène Lefachot, I think very inspiring female delegate from France. She was part of the resistance movement against the Nazi occupation. She received a medal for her resistance. Initially in both in the subcommission on the status of women that later became a full commission, they had representatives in all meetings where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being discussed and debated. So they had 2 representatives, but they didn't have any voting rights or any influence in that sense in the drafting of the declaration. But she was initially very vocal in talking about the need to, for example, include sex in the non-discrimination list in the second article of the declaration. Later on, in the Commission on Women's Rights, she was one of the delegates who was trying to both represent France as a colonial empire and discuss women's international rights, which meant that she, for example, backed on her initial enthusiasm for universal suffrage, saying that this right had to be won gradually in the overseas French territories, for example. And you could see similar stances from other female delegates who represented Western countries that, have this kind of double stand. So in one hand, they talked about the need for universalizing the idea of human rights. On the other, they talked about the need for colonial territories to be civilized before human rights could be applied, or they referred to custom. Cassin, the French delegate, who initially was he's been also discussed as one of the fathers of the declaration together with Humphrey. He also referred to custom and culture in later debates, especially when they discussed the covenants. And next. I have inserted here some of the suggestions for the language in the declaration that was actually not adopted. So, for example, the Commission on Women's Rights, where you had delegates from India and other countries where women did not really have a strong legal position. They wanted, for example, Article Right to also include a spirit of sisterhood, not just brotherhood. And they wanted monogamy to be a principle in Article 16 on the rights in marriage and at its dissolution. So they pushed for some more progressive language in terms of women's rights. For example, having his and hers being repeated throughout the declaration. You don't have that now. You have the language of his and, his honor, his family in the whole declaration. Eleanor Roosevelt thought that it was unnecessary to have those kinds of repetitions throughout the text. But she was also, as both Danielle and John have mentioned, as a chair for the initial drafting committee, and later on trying to get the declaration adopted in the General Assembly was a really difficult role for her. because there was a lot of resistance already in the end of 1948 against this idea of having a declaration on human rights, even though it's not legally binding, it's more a political proclamation. And next. An article that was controversial in the declaration was Article 16 on the right to marriage. And here you saw a difference between, for example, the position of the United Nations, United States and Pakistan. United States felt that Article 16 did not really have a natural place in the declaration because these are rights in the private. And the US was more inclined to discussing rights in the public, political rights, civil rights. But Shaista Ikramullah here, who was a female delegate from Pakistan in the Third Committee. Pakistan gained their independence in 1947, and then they sent Shaista Ikramullah to the Third Committee. She argued for the need to ensure, for example, that everyone should have the right to marry from family, but equal rights as to marriage, so that you would have consent of the intending spouses, because there were other delegations, other Muslim delegations discussing the difference between legal age in different countries. So this was a great debate when Article 16 was on the table. So from which age do you have the right to enter marriage, and when can you give your free and full consent? This is still something that countries discuss a lot, that they want always to kind of like lower the age of consent for some reason. And we have seen the US backing also today on the idea of women's reproductive and sexual rights, and those are also rights in the private, talking about health instead. But for women at this time in history, and also today, who look at the legal, cultural, economic position of women, they argue that you cannot just talk about women's political rights without ensuring that women and girls have a protection in the private, because if you get married off at a young age, it's really difficult to get your education, to actually use your right to vote, etc., etc. And next. So as was also mentioned before, adopting a universal declaration for human rights was one thing, but then to ensure that this was actually not just empty words, but that this would become rights that could be legally binding upon ratification by member states. Eleanor Roosevelt and Hansa Mehta, they continued their collaboration in the Commission on Human Rights, but it became a very prolonged process to ensure that the two covenants on human rights were being adopted at the UN General Assembly, and due to Cold War fractions and conflicts, they had to. There was this idea that you would actually have a international convention on human rights, but it had to be divided into two covenants, and today we talk a lot about the fact that you cannot treat human rights as like just the first generation and then the second generation of rights, because they are interrelated, and in order to ensure the one generation rights, you need to also ensure that the other generation rights are being respected. And next. I wanted to actually end with a quote by Begum Hamid Ali from India, because at the founding of the United Nations, there were only a handful of women. You had four female signatories of the UN Charter, and then you had around 17, 18 women delegates in the first Commission on the Status of Women. You did not have so many women in the General Assembly. There was a push to ensure that at least in the future there would be more female delegates at the UN. And Begum Hamid Ali said, to know, to teach, to serve is not enough. An active participation of women in governments is what is urgently needed if the womanhood of the world is to take its rightful place. Only then can we throw out our weight for peace and outlaw war. This is not, again, a vision that has not really been fulfilled. We still have a big majority of men being represented at the United Nations. I think this is one of the weaknesses with any democratic process, is how can you ensure that you are really talking about a democratic organization or a democratic government in a country when you have mostly privileged people from only one gender, not having a diversity, and ensuring that there are voices that actually talk about the rights for those who are not being represented at the United Nations. And something that I found interesting when looking at this process of drafting the declaration, but also how human rights were being used in African countries by women organizations pushing for democracy and trying to raise their voices against human rights violations by administrative colonial powers, is how women at the UN who were representing countries that had just gained their independence from colonial powers, they were the ones who spoke in solidarity with people in non-self-governing territories, and who said that we need to have a more inclusive language and so forth. So I think at all of these international multilateral discussions, it's really important to have people with some kind of experience of oppression, some kind of experience of human rights violations, some kind of experience of being in illegal territories where you actually don't have human rights, because they will have this understanding of the experiences and the life and the hardships behind these words, because these are not really just empty words. They mean something, and they could mean more in this world today. Next, this is all. Thank you. Thank you, Leo.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was a really wonderful presentation, talking a bit about the contributions of women, particularly from countries that and in places that may not necessarily have had a voice, and representing the voiceless, as you mentioned towards the end of your presentation. So we're going to open it up for questions. So as I said, feel free to use the Q&A button, which is at the top bar of your screen. I don't see any questions yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up and see a general question to all of our speakers. So why do you think, given the work that you've done on the history of the UDHR and the development process, why do you think it's important to preserve and make accessible these records in relation to the UDHR and its development? Like, what does it mean in this day and age to have access to this information and to talk about this document? Who wants to weigh in first?
I mean, I would say that, we have human rights violations every day we have. It's just very depressing. It was the world was depressing at the end of the Second World War. The world is depressing today, and this idea of human rights is an idea of trying to salvage some kind of feeling of human dignity, even though human beings are so good at trying to destroy human dignity and trying to destroy this feeling of humanity. But I think being reminded of the history, being reminded of the inspiring people who actually try to, you know, believing in something more and try to push for something more, it could invigorate public debate today, but also to identify what is fascism, what is Nazism, what are the kind of the mechanisms behind that, and never to lose sight of this initial idea that they had, that, you know, human life is really precious and we need to ensure human rights for all without distinction and without discrimination. But it's, in a sense, like the idea of human rights, it feels so, it feels like something that you shouldn't have to remind people of, but still you need to remind people that everyone is born equal in rights and dignity.
Thanks, Rebecca. John, do you want to weigh in from a historian's perspective about why having access to these records is important? Like, why should we continue to make drafts of the UDHR accessible, and talk about John Peters Humphreys and others?
Okay. Sorry, I had some trouble understanding your question because I've got this stereographic effect of you and the computer coming at different times, and I felt I was in Grand Central Station during some rush hour. But I gathered you were saying, why is it useful to have archives? Well, I could give you one example. If I could put it on my PowerPoint again, I could show you, but Rebecca gave a quote, something to the effect that there can't be a lasting peace without human rights, and there can't be human rights without a lasting peace. I don't think she said where it came from, but if you look at the third type draft of the page I showed, you will actually see that Humphrey in his preamble, number 1, said there can't be peace without human rights. And he showed it to Eleanor Roosevelt, and she said, well, yeah, but you should also say there can't be human rights without peace. And so they developed that idea, even before he went to the Human Rights Committee, that there was an interdependence between peace and human rights. And that got into Humphrey's preambles thereafter. But for me as a historian, I mean, all kinds of original documents and archives are terribly important. I mean, I love them. And go through, because you can do original research, you can come up with things that people didn't know. And as was mentioned earlier by Danielle, they've now microfilmed all these things, and some of them are becoming digitized. When I found this thing, there was nothing except Humphrey himself brought home all the documentation, mimeograph documentation from the Human Rights Commission, from ECOSOC, etc. So one could go through that to find out exactly how these things came through all the summary records of all the hundreds of meetings. So I can see how things develop, but not everybody's interested in that. They just want to, how good is the final product, which was your first question.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Danielle, do you want to weigh in from the perspective of an archivist who's managing some of these materials? Like, what, from your perspective, why is it important that we as archives keep these materials and make them accessible? And I have a second question for you as well.
So from an archivist point of view, retaining history and making them accessible in a variety of formats. So as John had said, originally these archives had been microfilmed for easier dissemination. And now today we do digitize for a wider dissemination thanks to the wonderful technology that the internet provides us. But having access, researchers and the general public having access to these historical archives, especially the ones dealing with the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, allows for generations and future generations, like Rebecca had said, to continue to learn from and to continue to implement the ideas and ideals that the original drafters had in mind.
And is the material that's currently on your website related to the development and member country comments, is it still heavily solicited? Like, do you have any sort of statistics around that?
Very much so. So we have statistics for the electronic solicitations that happen through the platform, but also this summer we had 2 researchers who requested to have physical access to the archives, even though they're available from the comfort of their own homes, that to look at this information. It is one of the more solicited collections that we have.
Thank you both. I think we lost Rebecca, unfortunately. Probably some internet connectivity issues. Are there any questions from colleagues that have joined the webinar? Do you have any questions for our speakers, John or Danielle? I'll give it a minute so that people can type them in.
It looks like we have a couple questions in the chat. Would you
Okay.
like me to read them out?
Yes, please. That would be great.
Awesome. Perfect. The first question is from Suzanne. She says, thank you for great presentations. What is the weight of different titles in different languages? UDHR in English, DUDH, Droits des Hommes in French. And I think that's her question.
Oh, hold on. Sorry, I've muted you, John. You have to unmute yourself.
Someone muted me. I'm not sure I fully understood the question. Were they asking why does it have different acronym in different languages?
Let me reread the question.
The Declaration Universelle de Droits de l'Homme versus Universal Declaration, they're going to have different acronyms.
I think the question was, what is the weight of different titles in different languages? So weight. UDHR in English, the weight. Yes.
Right. Sorry, I'm too old. Maybe Danielle, you want to? I don't understand what they mean by the weight of them. Does it have greater force if you say UDHR versus something else? I mean.
So I think Suzanne Langlois wanted to contribute. Suzanne, I've allowed you to unmute yourself.
Okay, good. I'm sorry. She's still muted.
Yep.
Suzanne, you can now unmute.
We'll give it a minute. If not, let's move to the next question while Suzanne unmutes, and we'll see if we can come back to that one.
Sounds good. The next question is from Thomas. At the time when the UN and the Declaration were being created, was there any discussion of the importance of records and archives to protection of human rights, or is that only a later development at the UN?
I don't think they said we must preserve all these things. The UN automatically preserved all its documentation in mimeographed and unfortunately highly acidic papers. They just retained everything. I don't know that it was done deliberately. They just had to have it to refer back to, like you would archive your business papers as well.
I could add something to that. Sorry, John.
Go ahead, Nona, please.
So at the time of the drafting, right at the beginning of the UN, there is like the laws of the UN, so an SGB that does state that directors of divisions are obliged to transfer to the UN archives what they call important decision-making papers and papers of importance. So this was a general rule for the Secretariat, not necessarily purely for the protection of human rights, but it was for the protection of institutional memory. So right early in the UN, there was a consciousness of the need to retain important papers, again, whatever that definition happens to be, of the work of the UN. And it continues today. This law, let's say, has had several iterations, and it is still, there are still laws, entre guillemets, that affect the preservation of the UN's institutional memory.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks, John. Any other questions, Rio?
Yes, the next question is by Elaine. We are living through a period of increasing polarization and challenges to multilateral institutions. What lessons about consensus building and collaboration can we draw from the drafting of the Universal Declaration?
PC Chang would tell you to study Chinese philosophy for 3 years, and you could then build consensuses. I don't really understand how they achieved consensus on some of these issues and only had 8 abstentions, but you'd have to look at those 169 meetings and how the key players, who were then Chang and Malik, got it through. And they did get a remarkable consensus. Whereas with the covenants, they couldn't get any kind of consensus. And I don't think America's even signed the second one on economic and social rights today. Some people haven't signed the civil political rights one, so they're not universally accepted. But the UN has said anybody who joins the UN after the declaration must accept it in theory. So they accept the declaration, but it's not binding. I don't know. What do you think we've learned, Danielle, from the process?
Yeah, so the drafting process of the Universal Declaration was really one of the first multilateral processes that was sort of came about, and we saw this through, as I had mentioned in my presentation, that the inputs allowed from multiple parts of society, not just UN and member states and governments, but also organizations and private individuals. And I think today the multilateralism and multilateral discussions are just as important in today's as it was in 1947, 47 and 48 with the drafting. I don't know about consensus building. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
If I can just weigh in very quickly, having worked at the international level on a very small scale, when I was Secretary General of the International Council on Archives, to do consensus building, a lot of times it's outside of meetings where you have small groups. John, I'm just going to mute you, sorry. Where you have small groups of people that will meet outside of the formal meetings and have discussions. Sometimes it's to get particular political bent incorporated into an international document, or to try and get broader consensus about the actual wording of the document. So often it's undocumented. If we do have any record of these kinds of conversations, they'll probably be in private diaries more so than in the UN official record. But that, in my experience, is how you build consensus, so that you have everybody agreed in the meeting, as you do it offline, if you will, or off the record, and it's sort of conversations over dinner or over coffee, or maybe informal meetings outside of the formal sort of international meetings. Okay, we have time for one last question.
I believe, Suzanne, are you able to unmute yourself and potentially ask your question?
No.
Yeah, we can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yep.
Oh, good. Because I couldn't see my name anywhere anymore. The idea was ask the question that, you know, the rights of man, this was an expression that was put aside and say the human rights. In French, the French language maintained the Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme. I understand that there are different meanings, but quite often in French, it's criticized. They say they should have, you know, found another word to have the same meaning as the human rights, which does not really translate in French. And I imagine it's the same issues with other languages. So that was the purpose of my question. I also wanted to raise the issue because I've worked in the archives of the UN in New York and Geneva, but also the UNESCO archives. And I also work with film archives. And this is something that is so important to have the paper archives. And the work there is essential. And I'm trying to connect it to the propaganda, the film propaganda that was put together by the United Nations Film Board. And there was a big effort to deal with the Declaration of Human Rights. And I was wondering if in your work as archivists, you can explain what is happening with the this material that connects to the declaration, but is currently you know, jeopardized in the UN archive system.
So Suzanne, sorry, specifically the media archive, is that correct?
Yeah, she's muted.
Oh, okay.
I'm presuming it's the media archives, given that she's talking about films.
Yeah, so at the UN, the United Nations Information Service is responsible for maintaining all the media archives, so photographs, and television, radio, as well as films. And in the last couple of years, there has been a strong push by the media archives and library in New York to ensure that they have a full inventory list of what there is available, which sounds pretty basic as an archivist. To know what you have is the first control you get over your collection. And in the last 15 years, they have also been working towards digitization of key films and programs to make them available on their online platform. And they continue to do so when resources permit them to do that.
Thanks, Danielle. So we've reached the end. We still have 2 questions. What I will do is I will collect those questions, and then Mehdi and Tom, I will send you the responses from the speakers so that we can address those. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today on our first lecture as part of the sort of commemoration of the John Peters Humphrey fall inscription. Our next one will be on October the 22nd on archives and Human Rights. So I encourage anybody who's interested to please sign up. It'll be at the same time, which is 10 Eastern Standard Time here in Canada. So I will leave you to do your conversions if you're from elsewhere in the world and joining us today. Thank you very much to our speakers for taking the time. Danielle, unfortunately, Rebecca had an internet connection issue, which thankfully kicked in right after she'd finished her presentation. And as well, thank you so much to John Hobbins for his presentation too. Thank you to Rio, who's been, and to Chidimi, who have been in the background helping us out on the technical front and fielding questions. And thank you to all of our participants. So I hope you have a good rest of your day, and thank you very much for joining us.